Good evening, everyone. My name is Kaylor Sweeney, and I serve as the Public Programming Manager here at the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies. It is my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's program, Why World War II Still Matters. The Hauenstein Center's mission is to raise a community of ethical and effective leaders for the 21st century. That mission is inspired by our namesake, Ralph W. Hauenstein, whose service during World War II and lifelong commitment to the public good remind us that the leadership of the greatest generation still has much to teach us today. Unlike most generational monikers, those of the greatest generation were not born with that title, they earned it. It was the combination of the global crisis of World War II and their willingness to rise to the occasion that made their generation so distinguished. Perhaps there is room for us to reflect on these two factors in our own time. What crises or opportunities might call forth our own leadership, and how might we honor the memory of the greatest generation by meeting those challenges with the same courage and commitment they displayed. Tonight's program is a chance to reflect on those questions and to draw inspiration from the past as we think about the kind of leaders we want to be. Finally, I'd like to thank the Greatest Generation Celebration Committee, our partners and our sponsors who made this program possible. And now it feels natural, after speaking to the legacy of Ralph Hauenstein and the call to community leadership, to introduce Brian Hauenstein, who carries forward his grandfather's legacy of service in many ways, including his years of service on the Hauenstein Center Advisory Cabinet and as co-chair of the Greatest Generation Celebration Committee that made this week of events possible. Please join me in welcoming Brian to introduce tonight's speakers.
Good evening, everyone. It is my privilege to welcome you to this special event at the Hauenstein Center, a gathering that reflects our community's enduring commitment to remembering and honoring those who came before us, the men and women of what we so rightly call the greatest generation. Tonight, we are joined by a remarkable voice in the effort to preserve and better understand the legacy of the 20th century America, Garrett Graff. Additionally, I would like to also acknowledge someone very special in the audience, Susan Eisenhower, granddaughter of General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Susan has become an incredible voice in preserving and sharing the story of her grandfather and the generation he led with such distinction. We are honored to have her here with us tonight, and we hope that many of you will join us tomorrow evening with Susan at the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Museum. Now, back to Garrett. Mr. Graff is a distinguished journalist, historian, best-selling author, whose work has shed new light on some of the most defining chapters of the modern era. From 9/11 to the Cold War, from Watergate to the secret world of national security, his deep research and compelling storytelling have brought, history and vividly to life, not just as dates and facts, but lived experience. His recently published work, When the Sea Came Alive, takes us directly into the chaos, courage, and sacrifice of D-Day. By sharing firsthand accounts from June 6, 1944, it shows that history lives on through the memories and the actions of those who experienced it. Last month, Mr. Graff introduced his latest work, The Devil Reached Toward the Sky, a powerful new book that continues his exploration of American hidden histories and untold narratives. It promises to be yet another essential contribution to the understanding of the past that shapes us still. It is that very spirit of service, sacrifice, of shared purpose that we celebrate tonight. As we continue the Greatest Generation celebration, we honor not only those who fought on distant shores, but also those that served here at home with resilience, unity, and a quiet courage. Before we begin, I want to thank each of you, veterans, families, neighbors, friends, for being here this evening in remembrance and reflection. Now, I'd like to welcome Joel Westfall, the Deputy Director of the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Museum and the Chairman of the Greatest Generation Celebration, to the stage. Joel will moderate a discussion with Mr. Graff, an opportunity to dig deeper into his research, insights, and the stories behind the stories. After that, we'll open the floor for your questions. So now, please join me in giving a warm welcome to a historian of rare insight and thoughtful perspective, Garrett Graff.
Garrett and I have shared the stage more than a few times, and I have had Garrett come to Grand Rapids and Ann Arbor more than any other lecturer in my Rolodex. He is, I'm a fanboy and a massive fan of his work, and I'm super excited about tonight, and I'm super excited about the size of the crowd tonight. Thank you very much for showing up. The first question: when you told me some time ago you were working on an oral history of D-Day, the first thing that came to my mind was, has anybody done that? I'm not sure. I need to check. And I did that later on that evening after we had drinks at the rendezvous, and it turned out no one has. And then of course I thought, why didn't I think of that? That's a really great idea. What got you to do? This is very original. It's the first time anybody has ever done an oral history of the single most important day in the 20th century. What was the genesis of that?
Yeah. So I've come over the course of my history writing career to somewhat specialize in oral history. And if you're not familiar with it as a format, it tells these events solely through the first person memories and experiences of the people who lived them. So the D-Day book brings together the voices of about 700 participants on all sides of the D-Day experience, the months and years of planning that go into it, and then that day from the perspectives of Americans, Brits, Canadians, Germans, French, and all of the other nationalities that participated in that incredible endeavor on June 6, 1944. And I had done a previous oral history in 2019 that was called The Only Plane in the Sky. That was an oral history of 9/11. And to me, there is a unique power that comes from oral history in that it helps you experience events where you know how the events turned out, but through the shoes and the experiences of the people who are living them at a moment when they don't know what the outcome actually was. And that was that power sort of especially came to me in working on that book in 9/11, because you see in the memories of the people who lived through 9/11 how different the experience of living that day was from the history that we tell of that day. The history that we teach is that the attacks begin at 8:46 in the morning. The whole thing is over 102 minutes later with the collapse of the second tower. At 10:28, there are 4 planes, 4 attacks, 3,000 people die. And that is all factually true, but if you remember living through that day, that's not the day that any of us who lived through that day actually remember. We didn't know when the attacks began. We didn't know when the attacks were over. We didn't know how many attacks there had been. We had no idea how many hijacked planes there were. The US government believed that there were more than a dozen hijacked planes still in the air at 1 o'clock that afternoon. And that there was sort of this dawning realization over the course of that day that many of us went through. And you see this in the memories, for instance, of the people evacuating the World Trade Center, that they go through, the World Trade Center is a huge building, and so they go through the same level of confusion that all of us, a plane hit the building. Probably a small plane, probably maybe a pilot had a heart attack, maybe there was mechanical problems. And there's this 17-minute gap between 8:46 and 9:03 where you see just how innocent America actually was on the morning of Tuesday, September the 11th. That it's not until that second plane hits that America realizes it's under attack. And you see that again in the oral history, in the personal memories. You're probably sitting there remembering going through those same 17 minutes wherever you were on 9/11. And that, to me, that moment was so important for when I was working on that project. The book came out in 2019, which was the 18th anniversary of 9/11, and it was a moment where a generation who had grown up in the shadow of 9/11 in a world shaped by 9/11, but had never known the America before 9/11 and didn't know what 9/11 had been like to actually live. And that you were watching sort of year by year 9/11 slip from memory into history. And today, it's about 40% of America is too young to remember the events of 9/11, which is sort of a stunning transformation as we approach the 25th anniversary. Yeah. And so did that project in 2019. And as I was sort of thinking about what I wanted to tackle next as an oral history, I was drawn to World War II because it was at the opposite end of that arc of history. That I think as we watch these 80th anniversaries go by, they feel so poignant because they also mark the final passing of that greatest generation. For the 80th anniversary of D-Day last year, there are just a few dozen participants of D-Day still left alive in the United Kingdom of hundreds of thousands who participated 80 years ago. And so I wanted to capture this moment where we have every first-person memory we will ever have of World War II. Mm-hmm. And to try to tell that story for our generation, who we will never know World War II as living memory, and we've all only experienced it as history. And from now on, mm-hmm. it will only ever be history to people.
What is it about D-Day that triggers us? And what do I mean by that? Well, we often remember two specific dates when it comes to the Second World War. We remember D-Day and we remember Pearl Harbor. Days like VE Day, VJ Day kind of go by the wayside in our remembrance. But we always remember December 7th and June 6th every single year. Why do you think that is?
So I think D-Day stands out, and I think of these, my D-Day book and the 9/11 book as bookends in some ways, the most significant day of the 21st century and the most significant day of the 20th century. And that what I think stands out for D-Day is it is the greatest day in the history of democracy. That what stands apart in the legacy of D-Day is it is one of the only invasions in human history launched to liberate and not for conquest. That it is a sort of among the most noble causes that humans have ever fought. And that every other sort of cross-water invasion of, in human history is one that has been aimed at conquest. And that this was an operation by the Allies, which is something that we can sort of talk about, this incredible partnership between the US and the UK and a whole bunch of other European countries contributing that day. You know, there were 700 Dutch sailors who were part of the D-Day invasion. I mean, just this incredible tapestry of nations off the coast of Normandy on June 6th. And it was an operation launched to liberate an entire continent. And I think that stands out to people for the sort of the triumph, but also the audacity. That, it is the largest invasion that the world has ever seen, probably given technology in the way that, you would never be able to pull off a D-Day surprise today in the same way. It is probably the largest invasion that we will ever see.
So in your preparation for When the Sea Came Alive, I'm sure you did some reading of other D-Day narratives like Sir Anthony's D-Day, the Battle for Normandy, Ambrose's Band of Brothers, Cornelius's Longest Day. Did you have a favorite?
So I think Cornelius Ryan's The Longest Day stands out because he managed to get sort of all of the really great stories of D-Day very early on. I think his book comes out in 1957. And it is just remarkable the level of research and narrative that he was able to reconstruct so close to the end of World War II, and get so much of the sort of incredible human drama of that day into that story, with a far less advanced level of technology and research ability than subsequent historians have had.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I mentioned this question earlier. Every good book on D-Day has to have a couple of things in it for me to kind of really think that it's a good one. You have to talk about Pointe du Hoc. You have to talk about the second light, Oxenbox, taking the Orne River Bridge, and you also have to mention who Omar Bradley called one of the bravest men that he's ever met, who was the only general who was in the first wave, and that was Teddy Roosevelt, the son of the president of the United States. And your book covers all of these things exceptionally well. It's really a great read, and I'm still amazed that it's the first one that was ever done as far as an oral history, and it captures that, like you said, that moment in time from a primary source way, and it's really great. Let's transition over to Devil. What is really unknown to a lot of people, for example, let's say everyone here kind of goes home and watches the last movie, Oppenheimer, which really covers things really well. But it did not cover this aspect well, that there were really two types of bombs. Each of them were absolutely, totally different than the other in so many ways. The triggering method, the fissile material, the teams that were involved, etc. What can we add to that?
Yeah, so I think we oversimplify the story of the Manhattan Project often to sort of J. Robert Oppenheimer and this band of physicists on this remote mesa in Los Alamos. And when you get into the Manhattan Project, what the real incredible aspect of it is the extent to which we bring the industrial might of the United States to bear on building the atomic bomb in a way that no other nation in the 1940s could have done. And I talk about this in the book in the context of we spend so much of our World War II history talking about the places where the war is fought. And that it is, Bastogne and Omaha Beach and Leyte Gulf and El Alamein and Midway and Guadalcanal, Okinawa. But World War II is won here in the United States. And it's won in the Willow Run bomber factories of the Ford Motor Company here in Michigan. It's won in the synthetic rubber plants in Ohio and in the shipyards and landing craft factories of Higgins Industry in New Orleans, and the giant facilities that we build in Oak Ridge, Tennessee and Hanford, Washington to refine the uranium and plutonium that sort of come together in these two atomic bombs. And those secret cities, and I said a little bit of this at the luncheon earlier today. So to give you a sense of the scale of these facilities, that these are secret cities that we carve out of effectively nothing in the midst of the wartime labor and material shortages in the desert in eastern Washington state and in the remote mountain valleys of Oak Ridge, Tennessee. Facilities that are like 50 miles wide by 50 miles long, where by the end of the war, they employ 100,000 people apiece. And the uranium factory in Oak Ridge, Tennessee is the largest roofed building in the world at the end of 1945. And on August 6th, 1945, the day that the Manhattan Project is announced to the world, the bus system in Oak Ridge, Tennessee is one of the 10 largest public transit systems in the United States, and it serves a city that no one knows exists and that doesn't appear on a single map. And the sort of level of audacity involved in this. So the sort of first stage of the Manhattan Project is set up at the University of Chicago, where Arthur Holly Compton, who ends up, the Oppenheimer movie is wonderful and mostly historically accurate, except that it writes out the existence of Arthur Holly Compton, who is sort of the lead physicist who does the sort of first year of the Manhattan Project before Oppenheimer gets involved at all. And he leads the team at the University of Chicago building the first nuclear reactor in the squash court underneath the football stadium at the University of Chicago. And we're here on a college campus. Those of you who have a university affiliation, you will know that in modern times, a university risk officer would not locate the world's first nuclear reactor in the squash court of the old football stadium. But Arthur Holly Compton takes it upon himself to authorize the building of this chain reactor, and then later tells the president of the University of Chicago once it's already underway. And as they are building this first chain reactor, no one has actually glimpsed plutonium with the naked eye. Like, it exists only in literally microscopic elements. And there are physicists in the University of Chicago mapping out how to build these factories in Hanford, Washington, that will manufacture it at the level of kilograms. Just incredible sort of extrapolations of effort that go into the design of these two totally new bombs, what are originally called Fat Man and Thin Man. And these are code words that we don't know the exact origin of. There's sort of one set of stories that they are references to Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt. In that the sort of thinking was, if anyone heard about planes being modified to fit the fat man and the thin man, they would think that the U.S. was building VIP transports for Churchill and Roosevelt. There's another theory that these code names end up coming from the Dashiell Hammett stories of the day, like the Maltese Falcon. And one's going to use plutonium, one's going to use uranium, and then they get, there's sort of two separate designs that are basically firing a slug of one into a slug of plutonium into another slug of plutonium, slug of uranium into another slug of uranium in a gun assembly. And then they get to July 1944 and realize that plutonium's not going to work in the gun assembly. And they are years into this project, and all of a sudden realize, we might have built this entire facility in Hanford, Washington, with 100,000 people, and the bomb doesn't work. And they have this sort of crisis of faith that unfolds over several weeks in Los Alamos as these physicists sort of race to figure out a new plan and come up with what ends up being called the implosion model, where they'd sort of take a slug of plutonium in and then crush the whole thing into sort of build a shell of explosives around the plutonium and implode it, and then are able to set off a nuclear chain reaction that way, and are able to proceed with two designs, what come to be known as Fat Man and Little Boy, which are the two bombs that we end up dropping on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And the Hiroshima bomb is this sort of totally bespoke uranium bomb that basically is never ever used again. And every other nuclear bomb ever built in the whole rest of world history follows the plutonium model of the bomb dropped on Nagasaki.
I'm a big fan of counterfactuals, and I always usually like to ask one. This is the one. You recently wrote an article for the New York Times on the issue concerning the United States losing a wave of scientific knowledge and a brain drain of epic magnitude. I think it's important to discuss this and ask this question. Does America invent the atomic bomb without the Jewish scientists who fled Nazi Germany beginning in 1933?
Yeah, so this ends up being, we so immediately associate today the atomic bomb with the war in Japan and the war in the Pacific, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And the story of the Manhattan Project has almost nothing to do with Japan. It is rooted entirely in the fear of these mostly Jewish refugee scientists fleeing the enveloping cloak of Hitler's fascism, coming to the UK, coming to the United States, and begging the UK and the United States to launch their own nuclear atomic bomb efforts. And the US military wants absolutely nothing to do with this. The scientists, Edward Teller, Eugene Wigner, sit down with this group of military scientists in the fall of 1940, spring of 1941. And about halfway through the presentation, one of the colonels interrupts and says, "Look, I have a $10,000 reward for whoever is able to first build a death ray at the Aberdeen Proving Grounds that can kill a goat tied to a stake." And his implication is he thinks we're much closer to building a goat-killing death ray than we are to ever building an atomic bomb.
Yep.
And that the military wants nothing to do with this. And it takes them through all of 1940, most of 1941. They go out to Long Island and actually get Albert Einstein to write a letter to Franklin Roosevelt warning of the possibility of an atomic bomb. This sort of interlocutor takes this letter to Roosevelt, and Roosevelt goes, well, this doesn't sound great. We should look into this more. And it is actually only on Saturday, December 6th, 1941, that the U.S. launches what we now end up calling the Manhattan Project. And of course, the next day is Pearl Harbor, and it's off to the races. And that Arthur Holly Compton leads that first year, and they are desperate in that first year to beat Hitler. I mean, that is the driving motivation for this group of scientists. And I tell the story in the book. One of the scientists working on so in the fall of 42, they are working on building this chain reactor in the squash court. They're running 90 hours a week shifts. A day shift and an evening shift building this chain reactor. And one of the scientists talks about how he sees one of the other scientists who had just gotten off the evening shift come back in early to work the day shift the next day as well. And the scientist says, look, Hitler is at work on his bomb. And if Hitler's at work, I should be at work too. And they build the first chain reactor. The reaction happens on December 2nd, 1942. And there's sort of this incredible moment where they celebrate this chain reaction. And then there's this almost immediate sort of heaviness in the room, and everyone gets subdued. And they believe if they could build a reactor this quickly, Hitler is probably a year ahead of where the U.S. is. And that Hitler has surely built this reactor by now and is sort of a year ahead of them on getting the bomb. And that it's really only in the spring of 1945, as Germany collapses, that we're able to figure out for the first time that Hitler was never close to building a bomb. And that this moment sort of is a shocking realization for the scientists working on the bomb, many of whom then turn on the idea of ever dropping it on Japan, because they say, look, we got into this to fight Hitler. We wanted to drop this bomb on Germany to stop Hitler. We don't care about Japan. If Germany didn't get the bomb, there's no reason for us to use it. And Albert Einstein actually says later, if I had known that Hitler was never going to build a bomb, I never would have lifted a finger to help start the Manhattan Project.
One of the things we always have to talk about the Manhattan Project is the secrecy involved with that project. And of course, Brian had mentioned our special guest here tonight, Susan Eisenhower, granddaughter of Ike, Dwight. Did did Dwight, the Supreme Allied Commander of all forces in the European theater, know about the atomic bomb?
So, and I hope I won't get this wrong, and Susan will start heckling me from the audience. Eisenhower is actually brought in very late to the Manhattan Project, and actually, sort of most of the government is brought in pretty late. The State Department actually isn't even told about the Manhattan Project until 45, and that it becomes pretty clear pretty early that we're not going to ever use the bomb in Europe, which was, again, the goal of the scientists who are actually working on this, and that the bomb is not going to be ready until the summer of 45, by which point Japan is the only Axis power left standing.
Yeah, actually, I had a spoiler. She told me that it was at Potsdam at
Yes.
the same time at Potsdam when he was informed about
Yeah.
this.
Which actually is the same time Stalin is
That's
informed
right.
of it.
That's absolutely right. Actually,
that
Stalin
point.
actually knew about it before
Yep.
Dwight Eisenhower and Truman did.
But I mean, again, to sort of talk about the secrecy of this, Harry Truman doesn't know about the bomb until he becomes president. That he is at his first cabinet meeting, Henry Stimson, the Secretary of War, sort of stays after and is like, yeah, I should really come talk to you in the next couple of days about something. And that Truman is then given this briefing on the Manhattan Project where he's told of three things. First, the possibility of an atomic bomb, which is news to him. Second, the existence of the Manhattan Project, which is news to him. And remember, he was a senator in charge of the committee that sort of audited war spending. And what had happened was when his investigators ran up against the secret facilities of the Manhattan Project, Henry Stimson would call Truman and say, basically, I give you my personal guarantee that the factory that you're asking about right now is something that we need. And Harry Truman would go, okay, and his investigators would not audit that factory or that type of spending.
That leads me to one of my favorite stories early on in the book is the story of they're trying to get the funding off the ground. They need the money. Somebody comes in an office, says you need to go to this general, we need $15 million. When you go to ask him, he's not allowed to ask you what it's for. If he has a problem with it, you just tell him you need the money. He goes to the office, says I need $15 million, and of course calls up the general. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so this is so spring of 42 is when the military first gets involved with the Manhattan Project. This is a wholly civilian effort when Arthur Holly Compton starts it. But they realize by the spring of 42, basically, this is going to take a lot of money. And that they need to bring the military in order to both have a lot of money, but then also have the sort of organizational infrastructure to support building all of these factories, building all of these facilities. And so they bring in the Army Corps of Engineers. So they end up with creating the Manhattan Engineer District, which they call the Manhattan Engineer District because the first offices are set up in New York City. And sort of one of the things George Marshall jokes about in the book is like, imagine if we had set up the first office in Hoboken and this whole thing had become the Hoboken Project years later. And so James Marshall, no relation to George, is the first Army Corps of Engineers official brought in the end of June 1942. to this, and he's told by the head of the Army Corps of Engineers, walk down to the National Mall and go to this office and get a check for $15 million and don't tell them what it's for. And so he goes down to the office, and as one would hope, the official in charge of the office says, well, I can't just give you a check for $15 million without asking what it's for. It's basically like he's asking for a check made out to cash for $15 million. And which even in, this is World War II, $15 million is actually a lot of money back then. Then he, the official picks up the phone and calls General Steyer, the head of the Army Corps, and who sort of yells at him over the phone, like, I told you you couldn't ask what the money was for, just give the guy the check. And so he gets the check and walks it up to Vannevar Bush at the Carnegie Institution, who's sort of running the Manhattan Project off the side of his desk at that point. And, that covers the first set of bills for the Manhattan Project.
I had never heard that story before. I laughed. I think I giggled for a couple of seconds after hearing that.
But sorry, I just want to finish the Harry Truman point, so he's told in this meeting, after he becomes president, existence of the Manhattan Project, existence of the atomic bomb, and that in just a couple of weeks, we're going to have the first working bomb, and that basically we're going to drop it on Japan, as early, this is April 1945, we're going to drop it on Japan as early as August in 45.
I'm going to ask one more question, and I think then we're going to go to your questions. This is kind of a double. There is one fact of the war in the Pacific, and that is this. The leading cause of death of Japanese military and civilians was not bullets, bombings, or disease. It was starvation. And here, of course, we always have to get into the question, was the bomb necessary? There's always some that come up when we talk about the Manhattan Project. In my global history class at GRCC, I teach about the details of the bomb, how it works, the immediate effect, the after effects. I even show them a very detailed modern example of a nuclear explosion that occurred as a 1.5 kiloton explosion, non-nuclear, in Beirut in 2020, which was only 10% of Hiroshima, but it really gives that kind of effect. But then I talk about Operation Starvation. Now imagine that, what I just said. Operation Starvation, that today the United States government or military is going to create an operation and call it Operation Starvation. We know that half of the population of Okinawa died in the taking of Okinawa. We mined every single port in Japan. Hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians were dying monthly of starvation. Operation Olympic wasn't scheduled to kick off until November. Operation Coronet of the kind of more mainland China, where Tokyo is, wasn't scheduled to kick off until March of 46. Civilian deaths would have been in the absolute millions. I am a non-proliferationist, and I struggle with this question all the time. I wish to God these weapons would have never been invented. What do you think? And as well as when the bombs were dropped, what did those scientists say about them after their use?
Yeah. So the last sort of third of the book is this incredible juxtaposition of the celebration at Los Alamos and Oak Ridge and Hanford and at Tinian in the Marianas Islands, where the bombers depart and then return to, and then the horror of what these bombs do in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And you sort of switch chapter by chapter back and forth between these, the literal parties that are taking place in Hanford, Oak Ridge, Los Alamos. Los Alamos and Oak Ridge, they throw these huge parties on August 6th when the word of the atomic bomb being dropped on Hiroshima comes back. In Tinian, where the Enola Gay, the bomber that piloted by Paul Tibbets, lands, he is greeted with a hero's welcome. He has medals pinned on his chest on the tarmac, and then the whole unit goes off to a literal barbecue party with ration-free beer, to celebrate the successful bombing mission. And in Hiroshima, you have the people of Hiroshima living through this day-long firestorm with hurricane-strength winds that burns for the better part of 24 hours, killing tens of thousands of people. Now, when we look back on these events 80 years later, we come with this, I think, very clear and sort of binary moral framework of looking at the bombs as, did we have to drop the bomb? Did we have to drop the second one? Did Harry Truman make the right decision in dropping the bomb? That's not what it looked like to anyone involved in the process. And that's one of the things I really try to capture, again, in the oral history version of this, is you have to think about the permission structure that existed in 45 as we are narrowing in on the dropping of the bomb. That the deadliest day of World War II, the deadliest day of human conflict in world history, is not the atomic bomb. It is the Operation Meeting House firebombing of Tokyo that takes place in March 1945, where in a single incendiary raid, we kill 100,000 Japanese in a single night, burning out the heart of that city. Over the rest of the spring and summer of 1945, we burned 66 Japanese cities. So if you do that math, sort of every night, every other night or every third night, we are sending out hundreds of bombers to burn out Japanese cities. And these are cities that are, not just the cities that you know the names of, but the, cities that are the Japanese equivalent of Grand Rapids or Des Moines or Peoria, San Antonio, where we're destroying 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80% of a city in a single night, killing thousands of Japanese civilians. So much so, so thoroughly so, that the U.S. war planners, Henry Stimson and General Leslie Groves, and war planners actually set aside Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and a handful of other Japanese cities to save them for the atomic bomb. Because if we firebomb these cities first, there's not going to be enough of the city left to drop an atomic bomb on. You talk about Operation Starvation, which is the sort of naval mining and blockade operation that we are strangling the home islands of Japan with over the course of 1945. Japan's rice crop has collapsed across 1945. The average Japanese civilian is surviving on about 1,200 to 1,300 calories a day in 1945. They are on pace for a famine that fall that will kill upwards of 200,000 Japanese civilians every single month. So these are sort of astronomical levels of death and destruction. And then you sort of zoom out, and I know Rick Atkinson talked a little bit about this in his talk yesterday, if any of you went to that. The overall scale of death in World War II is unfathomable to us. That it is a death toll. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans has their official estimate at 60 million people who die in World War II. 45 million civilians, 15 million combatants, and that other estimates put that number closer to 75 to 80 million. So the rounding error on the total death in World War II is the entire population of the state of New York. Just sort of unfathomably large numbers. By the summer of 45, humans have killed each other across the war in almost every conceivable possible way. I mean, you talk about the famine, there are hundreds of thousands of Chinese killed by the Japanese in biological warfare. I mean, anthrax, cholera, typhoid fever, bubonic plague. I'll bet no one walking into the room tonight knew arriving here that more people were actually killed by biological warfare in World War II than were killed by the atomic bomb. I mean, these are just sort of astronomical numbers of deaths. And that Harry Truman never really makes a decision to drop the bomb. That the only real decision that Harry Truman makes is to not drop a third bomb after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and to give Japan a moment to sort of process what has actually taken place. And what we now understand, and this to me is sort of one of the wildest parts of this whole story, is that Japan was not actually particularly close to surrendering even after the second bomb. That there were the sort of one of the weird things about Japan versus Germany. I mean, we think of sort of the Axis countries as sort of this, axis of evil. Japan has a sort of very functional and normal government through all of World War II in a way that is separate from sort of Hitler's Third Reich in Germany. I mean, Japan has prime ministers come and go and cabinet ministers sort of come and go as different factions take over. And the imperialist sort of far right wing of the Japanese military, even after the second bomb, want to keep fighting. Even as this famine is beginning to take hold across Japan, they believe it is a matter of honor for Japan to continue fighting. And on the night of August 14th, they actually stage a coup on the emperor's palace to try to seize and destroy the emperor's recorded surrender message before it can be played to the Japanese public on August 15th. And sort of one of my favorite details of this is the reason that the emperor's surrender message survives and Japan actually does surrender on the 15th is that the emperor has hidden the surrender message in the women's portion of the palace. And the soldiers who storm the palace culturally refuse to go into the women's portion of the palace, which I sort of love the idea of drawing your red lines in your coup, where you're yes, we will stage the coup and storm the emperor's palace, but we won't go into the women's portion because that would be too insulting. And so they're actually able to play this message on the 15th, where Japan actually, where the emperor actually chooses to surrender.
And I actually mentioned there were actually two different messages, one for the people and the other for the military, in order to kind of calm down things that another coup would not actually occur.
And I quote a lot of I quote a lot of these in sort of the chapter on the surrender. A lot of the Japanese military is incredibly disappointed on that 15th. This is not like Germany, which is sort of collapsing quickly in the spring of 45, and you have sort of vast armies surrendering, and people sort of trying to, get out ahead of this surrender, a lot, there's, there are sort of waves of these kamikaze pilots and who are, disappointed on August 15th when they are called to assemble to hear these recorded messages, most of whom, by the way, are hearing the emperor's voice for the first time on August 14th, or August 15th.
All right, let's get to your questions. Microphone will be coming around.
Start right here. Hi. My husband and I were in Japan in March this year, and were able to go to Hiroshima to visit the Peace Museum there.
Yeah.
It was the signage on the exhibits in the museum was all in English too, that we could read things. And I thought this one statement was very interesting as far as what Japan states there, the reason why the U.S. decided to use the bomb. They had on the sign, the United States believed that ending the war with an atomic bombing would help prevent the Soviet Union from extending its sphere of influence. It would also help the U.S. government justify to the American people the tremendous cost of the atomic bomb development. That's what they tell their people.
Yeah.
The two most big reasons were that it happened.
Yeah, and part of the challenge of understanding this decision is all of that is also true, right? That, they're sort of one of the most existential questions of the atomic bomb was the dropping of the bomb the last act of World War II or the first act of the Cold War? And you could write entire dissertations on sort of that question. And that, one of our real hopes was, after seeing how Europe was being carved up by the Soviet Union, could we get Japan out of the war before the Soviet Union could mobilize its forces and sort of transfer them from the east to the west, the west to the east, to seize large parts of Asia for the Soviet Union, in the same way that they were sort of drawing that Iron Curtain, or what we now call the Iron Curtain, around Europe. I don't know. There's not a lot of evidence that we were ever too concerned about the justification to the American people of the atomic bomb spending. Part of the debate that the Los Alamos scientists and the University of Chicago scientists end up having is, could we bring Japanese officials, to an island or to New Mexico to explode a demonstration bomb and show them what this bomb could do before, and would that get them to, say, we're going to show you this bomb, and if you don't surrender in, 4 days, we're going to start dropping it on your city. They turn against that for sort of a couple of different reasons. One being, they're actually not really sure whether watching an atomic bomb explode would be all that horrifying or convincing to the Japanese officials. They also get pretty concerned about, we don't have a lot of these bombs. We have 3.
Yep.
And our production is going to pick up, and by September, October, we'll start to have a couple a month that we could have ready. We actually have a plan on the books to back up the invasion if and when that comes to pass. There were going to be 3 landing bases or landing zones, and we were going to use 9 atomic bombs to back up the initial landings on the home islands, 3 per sort of landing sector. But we get real concerned as they sort of start talking about telling Japan about the possibility of these bombs, that what if Japan starts trying to shoot down our planes and is actually able to shoot down the bomb-carrying planes, and then we don't have any bombs to drop on them? And will that actually just delay the war even longer? And part of this, again, coming back to this theme that I've been talking about with the perspective that you get through oral history that's different. A big part of the story of the impact on the so-called Haibakusa, the bomb-affected people in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the survivors, is we know that we dropped an atomic bomb on them. They don't know that. There's no one in Hiroshima on August 6th, 1945, who has heard of an atomic bomb. And so they don't think anything of watching this one plane come over their city because they're sort of used to planes. Their question actually all summer is, why were they never firebombed? That they can't figure out in Hiroshima and Nagasaki why every other city in Japan has been firebombed and they haven't. And so they see this one plane come over, and it's the Enola Gay, and it drops the bomb. And then a big part of their story that day is emerging from the rubble into this incredible hellscape, and not understanding what has happened to them and their city. And how has one bomb done this? How has one plane done this to them? And that mystery continues on through the fall because the U.S. didn't really understand radiation poisoning, and Japan doesn't understand radiation poisoning at all. And so they, one of the big mysteries as the weeks and months after the bombing unfolds is all of these people who survived the bombing start dying. And what's going on? And what is this poison? And I quote some of the Haibakusa. They lived with stigma for years in Japan because people thought it was infectious. And so, a lot of the women who survive Hiroshima and Nagasaki, no one will marry them because they're sort of, they don't know what disease is living inside these people who survived Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And it's years before sort of the medicine begins to catch up with the reality of what is taking place in this radiation poisoning.
Yes, I would imagine that constructing oral histories around these monumental events, as you have done, would require a monumental effort of research and writing. Could you elaborate a little bit on your process of researching and writing such an oral history?
Yeah. So doing oral history is the opposite of normal writing because it is all subtractive, not additive. So I spend months gathering all of these first-person testimonials for both D-Day and the Manhattan Project book It was all archival research. I didn't speak to a single living person for the book. I did, as part of my research, go to Hiroshima and Nagasaki and actually got to speak to a survivor in Nagasaki there, but didn't use that in the book. Because part of what my goal is to get the memories as close to the events as possible. And memory is always fallible, traumatic memory especially so. And so with both of these projects, it was trying to get as far back in the historical record as I could. And so I was drawing from memoirs, oral history interviews. For the Manhattan Project book, actually a large number of Nobel Prize lectures, which is not a primary source I have much experience with before. Turns out, by the way, the hardest part of writing this book was explaining any of the physics involved in the words of the people who lived them is not who you want explaining any of the physics to you. That Albert Einstein is not the person you want explaining Einstein's theory of relativity to you in a way that you will actually understand. For the Manhattan Project book, actually, one of the great sources I got was the 1,000-page transcript of Oppenheimer's security clearance hearing in front of the Atomic Energy Commission, which is the narrative backbone of the Oppenheimer movie, because Oppenheimer actually just didn't speak about it that much. And so one of the only places he's really on the record with any length talking about the Manhattan Project was in the security clearance hearing. D-Day Project used a huge trove of oral histories at the National World War II Museum, some of which came from Stephen Ambrose and his work on D-Day. But for that book, I gathered about 4,000 different voices to start the project. I don't know exactly how many I got for the Manhattan Project book, probably the same number. And then you sit down and I have this sort of giant file. The first draft of the manuscript for both of these books started off at about 1.4 million words, which is about 4,000 pages. And then I'm a Vermonter, so I talk about this in the context of making maple syrup. And then you just sit there and you boil and boil and boil until you've gotten all of the sap down to just the syrup at the end. And so I cut about 95% of those first draft manuscripts down and sort of threw that all out to get down to the sort of finished final core of these books. The D-Day book is, I think, about 700 voices. Mm-hmm. The Manhattan Project book is about 500. And a big part, part of what also ends up being funny about that is you don't necessarily end up with the most important voices being the biggest ones, because what you want are people who are good storytellers, who are sort of good speakers and have an eye for detail, and sort of a wry wit to them. And so, a lot of the Manhattan Project book are voices you won't actually necessarily be familiar with, for the D-Day book, a lot of it is the voices of the people, around Dwight Eisenhower, not just Eisenhower himself.
You described the conception and construction of the atomic bomb as this unique product of its time that's completely unparalleled in terms of marshaling the materials, the research, the political will, and the manpower for it. Do you think it can be compared to another similar massive effort like the space race, or is this something that's just completely, like a flash in the pan, like it's not really going to happen? Like, again, it's nothing that could be compared to anything else.
Yeah, so I think in terms of, the Manhattan Project today sort of remains shorthand for audacity and daring. And, you can sort of see this with whenever we are confronted with a crisis in American life, politicians go out and call for, a Manhattan Project Manhattan Project style effort to do X, Y, or Z. And I think the only thing that we have seen that actually comes anywhere close is the race to build the COVID vaccine, where we sort of approached that in the same way that we did the original Manhattan Project, where we didn't know what was the right way to refine uranium and plutonium. And so they launched 4 parallel efforts, all fully funded, all sort of going gangbusters, with the hope that sort of one of them would actually end up working out. And it's sort of the same thing that we did with the COVID vaccine, where we said to sort of all the drug manufacturers, we don't know which of you will actually figure this out first, so we're going to fund all of them and launch all of these parallel efforts at the same time.
That's Operation Warp Speed.
Operation Warp Speed, yeah. I think, and I talked a little bit about this last night in Ann Arbor. What worries me right now, and you alluded to this because I wrote about it in an op-ed in the New York Times last month, is we are standing right now at the cusp of what arguably is going to be the first technology that is as potentially transformative to the world as the Manhattan Project and atomic energy was, with artificial intelligence. And that at the precise moment we are watching sort of this new technology arrive, we are unwinding the very model of innovation success that the Manhattan Project showed us. That sort of, we think, I think, too simplistically, that the outcome of the Manhattan Project is the atomic bomb. The outcome of the Manhattan Project is a whole new way of the US government looking at science and technology as a core strength of the United States. And it is a new way of looking at the way that government and higher education and science and medicine and technology can innovate together in this sort of shared set of goals and government-supported funding for science and medicine and technology. And it is that Manhattan Project model that transforms the United States after World War II, that delivers us this incredible age of innovation and invention and economic success and prosperity. The creation of the National Science Foundation, the creation of DARPA, the transformation of NIH into a grant-making, grant-giving institution. That's what delivers us the economic superpower status of the rest of the 20th century. And the payoff is incredible. I mean, DARPA gives us the internet. That's all government-funded science research that sort of underpins all of that. And that we are watching right now that model under attack in the country in a way as we stand at the cusp of this new age of artificial intelligence, that I worry a lot about what happens if this next generation of technology is not invented in the United States. And what happens if, for the first time since the Manhattan Project, the future is invented somewhere else, and not by America, and not in a rules-based system where we are the ones setting those rules. And if China gets there, first, that is not a future we want to be living in. And that to me is sort of the greatest gift that the Manhattan Project gave us. And I hope we don't squander it at this sort of very precise moment in time.
Great. Thank you very much. Well said. Oh,
Time.
we have time? Oh,
Okay.
great. Okay, do it. Let's do it.
Oh.
Over here.
Okay, okay.
Thanks so much. These oral histories are wonderful. I was curious if there was one particular one where you felt like when you read that, you're like, wow, that changed how I thought about whether it was 9/11 or D-Day or the Manhattan Project, that it had an impact on you, or you thought maybe it's going to have a huge impact on how other people see these events. Is there any particular one?
Yeah, so I think there are part of the power to me of oral history, again, is it ends up being a symphony of small voices. And it is, the role of all of these ordinary people in changing these sort of shaping these epochal world events. And so for me, like, a lot of these stories end up being the way that these people don't realize how incredible their own experience is in the midst of these world events. And there's one that really stands out for me from the 9/11 work, where across all of these books, there are very few characters that you follow the whole book through. I mean, most people appear in only a single chapter, or sometimes just a single quote, and sort of come and go as their sort of relevance to the main thread that you're following happens. One of the few characters in my 9/11 book that you follow through the whole day is this guy, Richard Eichen, who is one of the only survivors from above the 90th floor of the North Tower. And he is injured in the initial explosion, evacuates down the whole way to get out. That takes him a long time, so he's caught in the collapse of the tower, then makes it to a hospital where he's sort of treated in Lower Manhattan, then breaks himself out of the hospital because he's worried about a follow-on attack and sort of rumors of a follow-on attack. And so he, in a hospital gown, walks across the Brooklyn Bridge and then there's actually a photo of him from that day crossing the Brooklyn Bridge in this hospital gown, carrying a Snapple, which is sort of the only thing that he has to drink that day. And then he hitchhikes all the way home in Brooklyn on the back of a pickup truck to get to his house at the end of the day. And I worked off of the interview he gave to the 9/11 Museum for the book, and I met him after the book came out for the first time at the 9/11 Museum. And he comes up to me and he says, "I can't believe you included my story in the book." And I was like, "Richard, like, all due respect, I read like 2,000 of these stories, and yours is like the most incredible story I came across of any human being on 9/11. And he had just never had that sort of comparative set, because to him it was just his 9/11 story. There's another story, you sort of see that on 9/11. This guy, another office worker in the Twin Towers, makes it home to New Jersey, and then is, Tuesday night. It's picture night for his like flag football league that night, and he calls one of his buddies, and they're like, obviously, like, the photo for the flag football team tonight's been canceled. And the guy's like, "Why?" And they're like, "The nation was attacked." And he had just not made that mental leap. He gets home and he's like, "I just had a really bad day at work." and he's just sort of like in this, like, this was just something that happened to me today, and sort of hasn't really placed himself in this set of, sort of how these events unfold. And you see that, I think, actually in a lot of ways in D-Day, in the way that we talk of D-Day as this massive enterprise, the arguably most audacious thing humans have ever done. There are literally a million Allied troops in motion on June 6, 1944, across the United Kingdom and the English Channel. Almost all of them see only this incredibly small picture of this one stretch of sand or this one Norman hedgerow where the paratroopers fight that day. And that their sort of experience on D-Day is so atomized that, there are paratroopers who fight that whole day never actually knowing whether the landing has taken place. That they're sort of fighting by themselves, often literally, by themselves solo, in the hedgerows in Normandy, no idea if they are the only paratrooper who has survived, and whether the landing's been canceled. And am I the only American soldier on this side of the English Channel today? And you sort of see that in all of these individual experiences. And I think it's, to me, a great reminder of how all of us actually live our lives, which is, none of us know, what the story that we're living through right now, how it ends. And none of us know whether we are in the beginning, the middle, or the end of the story. And I think that that's a really important thing to remember. And I talked about this a little bit last night in Ann Arbor, that I think it's important for us to remember that when we think about the future, that the future does not have to look like the past. And that I think too often we extrapolate and imagine that the future that we are going to live in is a standard deviation of the past that we have already experienced. And that I think one of the lessons of going back and studying history, and particularly oral history, is none of us know how this story is going to turn out.
Well, I can say that I think you have all seen why myself, Director Clement, Ford Library and Museum, keep inviting Garrett back again and again and again. So Garrett will be, we're going to be doing a book signing outside. Stick around. If you don't have a copy of either of the books, they're going to be for sale outside. Get both. Thank you, Garrett.
Thank you.
And I'll just-
And thank you.
Yep. I'll just close this out by saying, yes, indeed, we're going to have some book signing and sales out in the exhibition hall. We also have dessert and some beverages available if you'd like to stay and chat and talk about what you heard here tonight. Finally, I'd like to invite you to attend our next event, our Constitution Day keynote on September 17th. This year's event is titled Making the Rules, the Presidency, the Courts, and the Constitution, and will feature law professor and legal scholar Ilan Werman. Thank you and have a great evening.